Okay, so let's look. These are actually on the worksheet that I gave you. This is problem number 1, or should be problem number 1 there on the paper that I gave you. Okay, we've got -2 sine squared of theta plus 1 is equal to 0. So principle number 1 still applies. We've got to get the trig function by itself. Now, don't stress over the fact that it's squared right now. Okay, do not stress over that right now. We just need to get it by itself. So we need to move the 1 by subtracting. And then we need to divide by the -2. So sine squared of theta is equal to positive 1/2. So trig function still is not by itself. It's being squared. Okay, the trig function is being squared. So the opposite of squaring something is square root. Okay, so we're going to square root both sides. Now, when we do that, we're taking the square root of a fraction. So number 1, we took a square root, so we need the positive and the negative. When you take the square root of a fraction, you square root the numerator. The square root of 1 is 1. You take the square root of the denominator. 2 is not a perfect square, so it's the square root of 2. Well, we don't leave square roots in the denominator, so we need to rationalize. So this is sine of theta is equal to plus or minus square root of 2 over 2. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the value of sine in every quadrant, because it's positive square root 2 over 2 and negative square root 2 over 2, so it hits every quadrant. So that is every pi over 4 angle that we have. Pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4, and 7 pi over 4. Now, there is nothing wrong with continuing to need to consult the unit circle. However, I would encourage you to start trying to do these without looking every time, particularly square root 2 over 2. You should be getting used to that one. You should know that it's your pi over 4 angles, and then you got to figure out which quadrant you're in. But I encourage you to start doing that because when you have to solve these trig equations, you're not going to have the unit circle in front of you. Okay, so you got to know how to find these values. Let's talk about checking it really quickly. Because your calculator, to check this, you're going to have to type this in just a little bit differently, because your calculator does not give you the option to put the squared where we put it in the equation. Okay, they do not give you the option to put the squared between the trig function and the angle. So what you have to do is you have to put an extra set of parentheses around your trig function. So you've got the sine of pi over 4, and then you have parentheses around that to tell the calculator, okay, take that value and square it. So let's look at that really quickly. Should be in radian mode. Yep, so we're good there. Okay, parentheses, sine, pi over 4, close the parentheses on the angle, close the parentheses around the trig function, squared, plus 1. And that gives us 0. If we check the other ones, it would give us 0 as well. Okay, but you got to put parentheses around the entire trig function before you square it. Okay. If you don't, I think it just considers that you're squaring the angle, which is very different. If you square pi over 4, that's pi squared over 16. That's a very different angle than the angle that you're intending for it to be. Okay, let's look at number 2. 4 minus cosine squared theta equals 1 plus 3 cosine squared of theta. This time we've got trig functions on both sides. Let's start with consolidating that, moving that to one side. We can do that because they are both cosine squared. So let's move that -1 to the right side. 4 is equal to 1 plus 4 cosine squared of theta. We had 3 already there, and we added 1 to it. Now we need to move the 1. So 4 minus 1 is 3. Divide by 4. 3 over 4 doesn't reduce. So 3 over 4 is equal to cosine squared. The opposite of squaring something is taking the square root. So anytime we take the square root, plus or minus, 3 is not a perfect square. The square root of 4 is 2. If you are doing this problem or doing any of these problems and you get something over here that is not on your unit circle, warning lights should be going off. You probably made a mistake somewhere, so you need to go back and check it if you get a value that's not on the unit circle. Square root 3 over 2, of course, is. So for cosine, the x-coordinate of the square root 3 over 2 is at our pi over 6 angles, and this is plus or minus, so we need them all. Pi over 6, 5 pi over 6, 7 pi over 6, and 11 pi over 6. So because of that squared, we end up with, normally we have 2 answers. If you square that, you're going to have 4 answers. Okay, not always, but the majority of the time when it's squared like this, you are going to have 4 answers, unless you end up on like one of them that's 1 or 0 or something like